3 days after their mother's funeral, 3 siblings opened an old Bible and found a letter that destroyed everything they thought they knew about her. Inside that letter was a secret their mother had kept for 34 years. A secret about a child who was never supposed to exist. A child who was very much alive. This is the true story of the brother nobody knew. Let's start at the beginning. At exactly 6:17 p.m. as the final rays of sunlight disappeared behind the cemetery trees, the last mourner walked away from Margaret Lawson's grave. The funeral was over. The prayers had been said. The tears had been cried. And like most funerals, people were already beginning to return to their lives. Cars started. Conversations shifted. Phones came out. Life moved on. But something remained behind. Something nobody noticed. Hidden inside an old Bible, plain, unremarkable, silent, was a small cream-colored envelope. Inside that envelope, a secret that had survived more than 3 decades. A secret Margaret had protected with every ounce of her strength. A secret capable of changing everything her family believed about her. For 34 years, she carried it alone. For 34 years, she lied to the people she loved most. And now that she was gone, the truth was finally free. 3 days later, her children would open that envelope and discover that the woman they thought they knew had spent half her life hiding another son. Margaret Lawson wasn't rich. She wasn't famous. She wasn't the kind of person whose name appeared in newspapers. But in her small town, she mattered. If someone was sick, Margaret showed up with food. If a family lost a loved one, Margaret organized support. If a child needed school supplies, somehow, someway, Margaret found a way to help. She spent decades serving others, giving, helping, listening. The type of woman people described using words like kind, dependable, and trustworthy. The type of woman nobody imagined could be hiding something significant. Especially not her own children. David, her oldest son, always saw her as nearly perfect. Responsible. Disciplined. Predictable. The kind of mother who never forgot appointments and always remembered birthdays. He never questioned her. Not once. Rachel, her daughter, admired her strength. After losing their father 8 years earlier, Margaret had continued forward without complaint. She carried grief quietly. Burdens quietly. Maybe too quietly. Michael, the youngest, knew her better than anyone. Or at least he thought he did. For the last 5 years he had lived nearby and helped care for her. Doctor appointments. Medication. Groceries. Repairs around the house. He spent countless hours sitting beside her. Talking. Laughing. Listening to stories about the past. Yet somehow she never told him the truth. Not once. Not even when her health began failing. Not even when she knew time was running out. Instead, she carried the secret all the way to her grave. Or so everyone believed. A few weeks before Margaret died, something strange happened. Michael remembered it clearly. He had stopped by after work, like he did most days. Margaret was sitting in her favorite chair by the living room window. A blanket covered her legs. A cup of tea rested beside her. She looked tired. Older than usual. Fragile. The illness had begun taking its toll. As Michael adjusted a lamp, he noticed she wasn't watching television. She wasn't reading. She was just staring out the window. Lost in thought. "Mom, you okay?" A faint smile appeared. "Just thinking." "About what?" For a moment, she seemed ready to answer. Michael could see it in her face. The hesitation. The internal battle. The words forming on her lips. Then she shook her head. "Old memories." Michael laughed softly. "You've got a million of those." But Margaret didn't laugh. Instead, her eyes drifted across the room. Toward the bookshelf. Toward the old Bible. The same Bible that would later reveal everything. At the time, Michael thought nothing of it. Just an old woman lost in thought. Nothing unusual. Later, he would replay that moment 1,000 times. Wondering if she wanted to tell him. Wondering if she almost confessed. Wondering if fear stopped her yet again. 3 days after Margaret's burial, her home felt different. The silence was overwhelming. No television playing softly. No sounds from the kitchen. No familiar footsteps. Just emptiness. Michael stood alone in the living room, surrounded by boxes. His brother and sister had already returned home to their own families, their own jobs, their own lives. The responsibility of sorting through their mother's belongings had largely fallen to him. Piece by piece, he packed away a lifetime. Photographs, letters, old birthday cards, recipe books with handwritten notes in the margins, receipts from grocery stores long since closed, ticket stubs from movies nobody remembered anymore. Each item felt like a doorway into the past. Every object carried a memory. Every memory carried pain. Hours passed. The sun moved across the floor. The shadows grew longer. Eventually, he reached the bookshelf. He removed the books one at a time. Then he picked up the Bible. Its leather cover was worn smooth in some places, cracked in others. The pages were soft, almost fragile, from decades of daily reading. Margaret had read it almost every morning. As he opened it, something slipped out. An envelope. Michael froze. His heartbeat quickened. On the front were 3 simple words. For my family. Nothing else. No explicación. No instructions. Suddenly the room felt colder. His instincts told him this mattered. A lot. Without opening it, he called David. Then Rachel. Both immediately sensed the seriousness in his voice. They could hear it. That edge, that tension, that unspoken something is wrong. By evening, all 3 sat around their mother's dining table. The envelope sat in the center, waiting. Nobody wanted to open it. And yet, nobody could look away. Finally, Rachel reached forward. Her hands trembled slightly. Carefully, she broke the seal. Inside were several handwritten pages. Margaret's handwriting. There was no doubt. The same loops. The same slants. The same way she dotted her I's with a tiny circle instead of a dot. Rachel began reading. If you are reading this, then I am gone. Immediately, silence filled the room. Not the comfortable silence of a family sitting together. A heavy silence. A silence that felt like it was pressing down on everyone. I have spent many years trying to find the courage to tell you the truth. I should have told you myself. I wanted to. Many times. But fear always won. A knot formed in Michael's stomach. Something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. Then came the next line. 34 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life. Rachel stopped reading. Nobody spoke. The room felt frozen. Slowly she continued. I allowed the world to believe a child had died. David frowned. What child? Rachel kept reading, her voice quieter now. The child did not die. The child is alive. Then came the sentence that shattered everything. One of you has a brother you never knew existed. Rachel lowered the paper. Her face had gone pale. David immediately shook his head. No. That's impossible. Our mother didn't have another child. But Michael wasn't so sure. Because suddenly, old memories were returning. Conversations that stopped abruptly when children entered rooms. Photographs that disappeared from albums. Questions that were never answered. Secrets hidden in plain sight. Rachel resumed reading. There is a blue box hidden beneath the floorboards in my bedroom closet. Inside, Margaret wrote, they would find proof. Proof that she had lied. Proof that the missing child existed. Proof that the truth was real. By the time Rachel reached the end of the page, nobody was crying anymore. They were stunned. Because grief had been replaced by something else. A mystery. One that had waited 34 years to be solved. And upstairs, hidden beneath the floorboards, the first pieces of that mystery were waiting. For several seconds after Rachel finished reading, nobody spoke. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly. Each second seemed heavier than the last. David stood first. This doesn't make any sense. Rachel folded the letter carefully. Then why would she write this? Maybe she was confused. Mom wasn't confused. Michael finally spoke. Mom wasn't confused. Everyone knew it was true. Even in her final months, Margaret's mind was razor sharp. She remembered names from 40 years ago. She remembered dates. She remembered stories. She wasn't confused. If she wrote those words, she meant them. The 3 siblings climbed the stairs together. Each step felt heavier than the one before. Michael led the way. Rachel followed closely. David came last, Reluctantly, Margaret's bedroom looked exactly as she had left it. The floral curtains, the neatly made bed, the reading glasses resting on her nightstand. For a brief moment, it felt as though she might walk through the door at any second. Then reality returned. She was gone. Michael opened the closet. The smell of old wood and cedar drifted out. Clothes still hung neatly in place. Shoes lined the floor. Boxes filled the upper shelves. Everything looked ordinary, until he noticed one floorboard. It wasn't quite level, just slightly raised. Almost impossible to see, unless someone knew exactly where to look. Here. David knelt beside him. Together they carefully lifted the board. Underneath was a small compartment. And inside? A faded blue metal box. Exactly as the letter described. Nobody moved. The box looked old. Very old. Dust covered its surface. Scratches marked the corners. Time had clearly touched it. Rachel swallowed hard. Open it. Michael lifted the lid. The hinges creaked softly. Inside were dozens of items. Photographs. Documents. Hospital records. Letters. Newspaper clippings. And on top of everything, a single photograph. The moment Michael picked up the photograph, the room changed. Because the woman in the picture was clearly Margaret. Much younger. Perhaps 20 years old. Holding a newborn baby. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were 2 words, "My Daniel." The siblings stared at each other. None of them had ever heard that name. Not once. Not in 34 years. Never. Yet here was proof. A baby. A name. A hidden life. Beneath the photograph, hospital records. Dated October 12, 34 years ago. The name on the forms? Margaret Lawson. And beneath it, Daniel Thomas Lawson. Rachel's breath caught. She gave him her last name, even after everything. Then came the adoption papers. Rachel read them twice. Then a third time. Tears filled her eyes. Because beside Margaret's signature were visible water stains. The ink had blurred, as though tears had fallen directly onto the paper while she signed it. Nobody spoke. Because nobody needed to. The pain was obvious. Margaret hadn't given away her child because she didn't love him. She gave him away because she believed she had no other choice. And that realization changed everything. The document slowly revealed a story nobody expected. In the early 1990s, Margaret wasn't the respected woman everyone knew. She was young, scared, and completely alone. She lived in a small apartment on the edge of town. She worked 2 jobs. Sometimes 3. Money was always tight. Every month felt like a battle. Then, she discovered she was pregnant. The father? A young man named Thomas. Charming. Ambitious. Completely unprepared for responsibility. At first he promised to stay. Promised to help. Promised they would figure things out together. But promises are easy. Reality is harder. When the pregnancy became impossible to hide, Thomas disappeared. No gouvier. No explanation. Just gone. Leaving Margaret alone to face everything. Today, a single mother still faces challenges. But 34 years ago? In that small, deeply judgmental town? Things were different. People talked. People gossiped. People remembered every mistake. Especially those made by young women. Margaret knew what was coming. The whispers. The stares. The shame. Church members avoided eye contact. Neighbors exchanged quiet conversations when she walked by. Friends slowly disappeared. Even some relatives distanced themselves. She felt trapped. Alone. Terrified. And as her due date approached, her fear only grew. The hospital records painted a heartbreaking picture. Daniel was born on a rainy October evening. Healthy. Strong. Perfect. Margaret held him for hours. According to one nurse's notes, she refused to let anyone take him from her arms. She counted his fingers, touched his tiny face, memorized every detail, as though she already knew she might lose him. For 3 days she stayed beside him. 3 days of love. 3 days of bonding. 3 days of becoming a mother. Then everything changed. A social worker visited. A difficult conversation followed. And a decision was made. A decision Margaret would regret for the rest of her life. After the adoption, Margaret returned home, heartbroken, lost, ashamed. And when people asked about the baby, she lied. At first, it was a small lie, a temporary lie, one she planned to correct later. She told people there had been complications, that the baby hadn't survived. The story spread quickly. Everyone accepted it. Nobody asked questions. Nobody looked deeper. The lie worked too well. Weeks became months. Months became years. And Margaret became trapped inside the story she had created. Every year that passed made the truth harder to tell. 5 years later she met Robert Lawson, the man who would become their father, the man she genuinely loved. She almost told him, several times. But fear stopped her. What if he left? What if he couldn't accept her past? What if he saw her differently? So she stayed silent. And silence became habit. Then David was born. Then Rachel. Then Michael. A new family. A happy family. Yet beneath every celebration lived an invisible wound. Daniel. The son nobody knew existed. Near the bottom of the box sat dozens of envelopes. All addressed to Daniel. None mailed. None opened. Margaret had been writing to him for decades. Talking to him. Telling him about her life. Explaining her choices. Apologizing. Loving him from a distance. Rachel carefully opened one. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Today your little brother took his first steps. I found myself wondering if you walked at the same age. I wanted to tell you. I wanted you to be here. But I didn't know how to find you. She opened another. It's Christmas morning. The house is full of laughter. Presents everywhere. The smell of cinnamon and coffee. I keep wondering what gifts you would have wanted. What you would have looked like opening them. Another. I saw a young man today, maybe your age, standing at a bus stop. For a moment, just a moment, I imagined it was you. I almost stopped the car. I almost got out. But what would I have said? Hello, I'm the mother who gave you away. So I kept driving. And I cried the whole way home. By now, Rachel could barely read through her tears. Because these weren't letters from a woman who forgot her child. They were letters from a mother who never stopped loving him. Near the bottom of the box, one final item. A folded piece of paper. Unlike everything else, it looked newer. Much newer. Michael unfolded it. His eyes widened. There was an address. A name. And a note written by Margaret herself. In handwriting that looked shakier than the other letters. Written recently. Written when she was already sick. If you ever decide to look for him, start here. The siblings stared at the paper. For 34 years, Daniel had been nothing more than a secret. Now suddenly he was real. A living person. Somewhere. Possibly unaware that his entire past was built on a lie. And for the first time since opening the letter, the siblings realized something. This wasn't just about discovering the truth. It was about finding their brother. Night had fallen outside. The room grew dark. Still nobody moved. Finally David broke the silence. His voice was raw. Different than before. What happens if we find him? Nobody answered immediately. Because that was the hard question. What do you say to a man whose existence was hidden for 34 years? How do you explain that your mother spent decades loving him secretly? How do you tell him that the woman who wanted to meet him most was already gone? Rachel looked toward the photograph of young Margaret holding baby Daniel. Then, quietly, she said, "We owe him the truth." For the first time all evening, everyone agreed. They would find him. What they didn't know was that Daniel had spent most of his life searching for answers of his own. And when their paths finally crossed, the truth would be even more complicated than any of them imagined. The morning after discovering the blue box, none of the siblings slept. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw the same things. The photograph. The letters. The name. Daniel. By sunrise, Michael was already sitting at the kitchen table. The blue box beside him. Contents spread everywhere. Rachel arrived shortly afterward, dark circles under her eyes, carrying a notebook already half filled with notes. David came an hour later, looking like he hadn't slept at all. Nobody bothered with small talk. The mission was clear. Find Daniel. For the next several weeks, the search consumed their lives. Every evening after work. Every weekend. Every spare moment. They followed every clue Margaret left behind. Some leads led nowhere. Others created more questions than answers. But little by little, the mystery began to unfold. The first address Margaret provided belonged to a family who had moved nearly 15 years earlier. The second lead turned out to be incorrect, a misspelled name, a wrong street, a dead end. The third lead? An old neighbor, nearly 80 years old, who vaguely remembered the adoptive family. At first, she couldn't remember much. Her memory came in fragments, bits and pieces. Then suddenly something clicked. I remember them. The Carters. Michael's heart nearly stopped. That was the first real breakthrough. A name. The woman continued. They moved away when the boy was still young. Maybe 4 or 5. I don't remember exactly where they went. What boy? Rachel asked, even though she already knew the answer. The woman looked at her, confused by the question. The adopted boy. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, Daniel. For the first time, they heard his name spoken by someone outside the family. And somehow, that made him feel even more real. While the siblings searched, Daniel lived completely unaware. He had built a good life. A stable life. He worked as a high school teacher. The kind of teacher students remembered years later. The kind who stayed after class to help. The kind who cared. He coached youth basketball. He was respected in his community. Married. A father. A man who appeared complete from the outside. Yet, there was one question that had quietly followed him for decades. Who was his biological mother? As a child, he occasionally wondered. As a teenager, he obsessed over it. As an adult, he learned to live with it. But he never truly stopped asking. Every birthday reminded him. Every major life event. His wedding, the birth of his children, the death of his adoptive parents. Holding his newborn daughter for the first time had awakened something deep inside him. A longing. A curiosity. A desperate desire to understand where he came from. Who did he look like? Where did his temperament come from? Did his biological mother ever think about him? Did she regret giving him away? But every attempt to find answers ended in disappointment. Closed records. Adoptive parents who didn't want to talk. Eventually he stopped searching. Or at least he pretended to. Deep down, the questions never left. 3 months after opening the blue box, Rachel finally found a phone number connected to Daniel. The moment she saw it, her hands began shaking. She stared at the screen, at those 10 digits, at the name beside them. Daniel Carter. This was it. After weeks of searching, months of questions, decades of hidden truth, everything came down to one phone call. David paced nervously behind her. Michael remained silent, sitting in a chair across the room. Rachel pressed call. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then someone answered. Hello. Rachel froze. For a full 3 seconds she couldn't speak. Then finally, she found her voice. Hi, my name is Rachel Lawson. I know this is going to sound strange. Nervous laugh came from the other end. Okay. Rachel swallowed hard. Then, she said the words that changed everything. I think we're family. Daniel didn't know what to think. At first, he assumed it was a mistake. Or maybe a scam. The story sounded impossible. A hidden adoption. A deceased mother. 3 siblings he never knew existed. Who would believe that? Yet Rachel sounded sincere. Genuine. Emotional. And something about her voice made him listen. For nearly an hour, they talked. Rachel explained everything. The funeral. The letter. The blue box. The photographs. The documents. By the time the conversation ended, Daniel still wasn't convinced. But he was curious. Curious enough to meet. A week later, the siblings gathered inside a quiet hotel conference room. Nobody knew what to expect. The atmosphere felt surreal. For 34 years, Daniel had existed only as a secret. Now he was about to walk through the door. Minutes felt like hours. Rachel checked her phone. Michael stared at the door. David stood by the window, watching for a car he didn't recognize. Then the door opened. And there he was. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They simply stared. Because the resemblance was undeniable. Daniel had Margaret's eyes. The same gentle smile. The same expression she wore when deep in thought. Rachel immediately felt tears forming. Michael couldn't believe what he was seeing. Even David, the skeptic, stood speechless. It was like watching a missing piece of a puzzle finally fall into place. The meeting began cautiously. Introductions. Awkward smiles. Careful questions. Then, Rachel handed Daniel the photograph. The one from the blue box. The picture of Margaret holding him as a newborn. Daniel stared at it. Longer than anyone expected. His eyes moved slowly across the image. The baby, the blanket, the woman holding him. The woman who looked like him. Then he turned it over. "My Daniel." Written in faded blue ink. For several moments he said nothing. Then, barely audible, he whispered, "She kept this?" Rachel nodded. "All these years?" Daniel looked away. He failed to hide his emotions. His shoulders shook slightly. He pressed his fingers against his eyes. Then came the letters. Dozens of them. Every one written to him. Every one saved. Every one never mailed. Daniel opened the first. His eyes moved across the page. Margaret's handwriting, Margaret's words, Margaret's heart. Then another. Then another. Hour after hour passed. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rushed him. Because these letters weren't just words. They were proof. Proof that he had been loved. Proof that he had never been forgotten. One letter read, "Today is your 18th birthday. I don't know where you are, but I hope someone is celebrating you. I hope there's cake. I hope there are presents. Because I would have been. I am." Another. "I saw a young man at the grocery store today. For a moment, just a moment, I imagined it was you. I almost said something. But what would I have said? So I walked past him. And I cried in the parking lot. That's what you've given me, Daniel. A lifetime of crying in parking lots." Another. "If you ever read this, please know that not a day has passed without me loving you. Not one. Not when I signed the papers. Not when I walked out of that hospital. Not through any of it. You have always been my son. And I have always been your mother. Even when I didn't deserve to be." By now, Daniel was openly crying. And nobody blamed him. Near the bottom of the stack sat one final envelope. Unlike the others, it carried a simple message on the front. For Daniel. Written shortly before Margaret died. Probably in her final weeks, when the illness had already taken so much from her. Daniel carefully opened it. His hands trembled. The room became completely silent. Then he began reading. "My dear son." His voice cracked. He paused. Collected himself. Continued. "If this letter has reached you, then I am no longer here. There are 1,000 things I wish I could say face to face. 1,000 apologies I wish I could make. But most of all, I need you to know the truth." Daniel's voice grew quieter, but somehow stronger. "I never stopped loving you. Not when I signed the papers. Not when I walked out of that hospital with empty arms. Not when I built a new life with a new family. Not when your brothers and sister were born. And I held them and wondered if you looked like them, if you laughed like them, if you would have played with them. Not for a single day. Not for a single moment." By now, everyone in the room was crying. Not the quiet, controlled tears of people trying to be strong. Open crying. The kind that comes from somewhere deep. Then came the final paragraph. "You do not owe me forgiveness. You do not owe me understanding. You do not owe me a single thing. But if there is one thing I hope you carry with you, after reading this letter, after learning the truth, after whatever comes next, it is this. If love alone could have brought you home, you never would have left." Daniel lowered the paper. And wept. Years of questions. Years of wondering. Years of imagining. Finally answered. The months that followed changed everything. Phone calls became routine. Family dinners became common. The first few were strange, full of careful questions and hesitant answers. But slowly, genuinely, they became real. Stories were exchanged, childhood memories, family traditions, the kind of details you only learn by spending time together. Photographs were shared. Margaret as a young woman. Margaret as a grandmother. Margaret the way Daniel never got to see her. Memories were created. New ones, to stand alongside the ones that had been lost. The lost years could never be recovered. Everyone understood that. 34 years is a lifetime. You don't get that back. You can't make up for missed birthdays, missed holidays, missed moments. Yet, despite everything, something beautiful began happening. Strangers became siblings. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But genuinely. And for the first time in decades, the family felt complete. 1 year after Margaret's death, they gathered at her grave. The same cemetery. The same quiet hillside. The same headstone. But this time, something was different. Daniel stood beside them. No longer a secret. No longer a mystery. No longer missing. He was family. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The wind moved softly through the trees. Birds chirped in the distance. Then, Daniel stepped forward. He placed flowers beside the grave. He stood there for a long moment, then quietly said, "I wish we had more time." Nothing else. Just that. Simple. Honest. Heartbreaking. As they stood there together, each person realized something. Margaret's secret had stolen years. Years of memories. Years of birthdays. Years of family gatherings. Thanksgivings without him. Christmases without him. Graduations, weddings, the birth of grandchildren. All without him. Years that could never be replaced. But the truth had given something back. A brother. A soul. A chance to heal. A chance to understand. A chance to forgive. Because sometimes the truth hurts. But sometimes, the truth also saves. Margaret spent 34 years believing silence would protect everyone. Instead, silence became her prison. Fear became her prison. Regret became her prison. Yet, in the end, the truth escaped. Not through anger. Not through revenge. But through a mother's final act of courage. One letter. One blue box. One hidden truth. And one family, forever changed. Because the secret didn't die with her. The secret waited. Patiently. Quietly. For the moment it could finally bring everyone together. And when it did, it set them free. Some secrets survive for years. Some truths take a lifetime to emerge. But eventually, the truth finds its way home. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like and share. And subscribe for more stories about secrets, family, and the truth that sets us free. I'll see you in the next one.